Hi, everybody. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you all today, and thank you to the organizers and to the Central Bank of Chile for wonderful programs. It has been excellent. This is joint work with Marina Halleck, who used to be my colleague at Columbia Business School. She's now at Yale. It fits in a broader research agenda that we started that is really inspired by Ken Rogoff's 1985 paper that is about commitment versus flexibility trade-offs in policymaking. Our other papers have focused on this topic in the context of fiscal policy and fiscal rules, and over time we've been evolving into thinking about the topic in the context of monetary policy. What I'm going to be doing here today, which is a little bit different from some of that other work, is thinking about flexibility in response to political pressure shocks, which is going to lead to some different types of concerns and considerations. So let me get started. And I'm also cognizant of the fact that it's the afternoon and I stand in the way of drinks, so I'll try to be as exciting as possible as I go through this repeated game between consecutive central banks that I'm going to describe for you all. So in terms of motivation, particularly in emerging market economies, the emerging markets have battled volatile, high inflation. There's various studies that will document this, and even after inflation targets have been adopted, in many cases, emerging market economies relative to advanced ones are likely to exceed the target, as we saw yesterday. And in terms of explaining this phenomenon, there's clearly a lot of economic factors behind this trend, but there's also a view that this is really reflecting something deeper about political institutions and the extent to which a central bank ends up caving into political pressure. And the basic idea is that if we increase political pressure, and also if we increase political instability, which can increase the volatility of that political pressure, we're going to end up with more inflation, we're going to end up with higher volatility of inflation, and also more persistent inflation in the sense that we can have regime changes. And what we do in this paper is we consider this issue of political pressure, and we take it as given. Part of what we saw yesterday is a lot of discussion of how to mitigate this political pressure through various efforts. I'm going to take it as given that there is political pressure and that central bankers are going to face political pressure in real time, and it's going to be problematic to resist it, or it's going to be very costly to resist it. And central bankers are going to have to think about this issue while at the same time considering the value of the long run livelihood of the central bank and central bank credibility. So there's a sense in which reputation and long run reputation of the central bank is going to matter. So I'm going to take a very simplistic model that's going to have this political pressure. It's going to evolve over time. It's going to be IID. And I'm going to characterize the best monetary policy. And in contrast to some of the work I've done before and has been done in this context, it's not going to be delegation in the sense that there's no enforcement procedure whatsoever. There's no formal enforcement procedure. And everything that happens has to happen because of reputational considerations and whatever happens if the central bank caves into the political pressure. And I'm going to describe how inflation and inflation dynamics is going to respond over time. And just as a little bit of a preview of what's going to end up happening, I'm going to suggest that part of why central bankers are disciplined to resist political pressure and to keep inflation stable is because they recognize that not doing so can lead to a regime change into a higher inflation regime change. I'm also going to show you that sometimes that transition will happen in equilibrium, sort of like the 1970s. You can think that caving into political pressure now doesn't have only implications now, but it has implications in the future. And moreover, at the very end, I'll show you exact conditions, theoretical conditions, under which we should observe these transitions between hawkish low inflation regimes and dovish high inflation regimes along the equilibrium path as characterizing equilibria in this type of scenario when there's time-varying political pressure. So here's the model. It's an infinite horizon model. There's only one source of uncertainty for simplicity. We've added economic shocks, but this is just to focus on political pressure, and political pressure is this term theta, okay? It comes from a bounded set, it's positive, and it has a PDF density function f. That density function has to satisfy certain conditions which would hold under almost all distributions you can think of: uniform, log normal, beta, exponential, and so on. It's a Barrow-Gordon type of model where what you have is that the central bank enters the period, it experiences a certain level of political pressure, and then it chooses the inflation rate. Now, there's going to be an output gap. That's what you see here, the output gap x. The output gap is proportional to the inflation surprise. What's the inflation surprise? It's the inflation that's chosen by the central bank relative to the inflation that was expected. The inflation that was expected prior to the realization of this political shock. Okay? Now, society has the following welfare. It cares both about the output gap and about inflation. So there's some inflation losses here, and then there's a weight on the output gap there. And this is linear, and I've normalized it by the slope of the Phillips curve. And what this does for tractability is it basically means that this object V, which I'm going to be referring to in the future, which is social welfare, only depends on the level of inflation, not on the output gap, because the output gap in expectation is 0. Okay, so we're not going to care about the inflation surprise. Now, here enters now we have to think about the central bankers. The central banker is the authority that's going to be delegated to conduct monetary policy. And here, political pressure is featured. Okay, so you could see that after the political pressure shock has been realized, the central banker cares about inflation, but also puts a weight on the output gap, and that weight on the output gap depends on the degree of political pressure theta. How can you think about this? You can think about this in terms of, you know, some kind of the elected official wants to have, you know, the economy be a little bit overheated, or there could be some fiscal considerations, and we've put the shock in here. There are other ways to model this shock, but we thought that this is a natural way to do it. There's a paper by my colleague Rick Mishkin and Westelius that do it this way. Now, the central bank wants to cave into the political pressure in the immediately. However, it really cares about the long run, about maintaining low inflation in the long run. So there's a time inconsistency problem that's familiar that emerges here. Let me mention a few. So this is the environment, and I'm going to solve the best equilibrium here. I want to mention a few things about this environment that are crucial, that are going to lead to the dynamics. Oh, I forgot. Once you substitute in for the output gap in here, you see that the central bank basically cares about overweighs inflation in its criterion. All right. So first, as you would be familiar with, the central bank has a time inconsistency problem. It wants inflation to be set at 0, which is what's optimal in this for society. That's what it would like to commit to. The problem is political pressure shock has manifested itself, and then ex post, the central bank, if it didn't face any costs down the road from doing this, it would prefer to choose a positive level inflation, which is proportional to the degree of political pressure. The political pressure shock is sort of giving us an idea of how severe, how big the level of inflation the central bank wants to choose if it were free to do what it would like. This pi f is going to be an object that I'll refer to later, which is the flexible level of inflation the central bank would like to choose. Now, the second crucial feature of this environment, in addition to the time inconsistency issue, is the fact that the level of political pressure is private information. We think that this is realistic. We don't know how much pain the central banker feels from whatever is happening behind closed doors or inside the central banker's heart regarding the amount of inflation that is desired. So we can't write contracts on this. That's basically what that says. Okay? What that means is that if we look at a dynamic interaction over a sequence of generation of central bankers, future central bankers aren't going to look back and say, well, 2 periods ago, this was exactly the level of political pressure and this was exactly the level of inflation we saw. We're going to rule that out. Why? It's private information. We can't quantify it. And then finally, there's no court system. There's no one enforcing central bank behavior here. The only the only thing that is enforcing central bank behavior is the expectation of future policy by future central bankers in response to whatever we do today. Okay, so this is entirely sustained by reputation. Okay, so that's the environment. Now what I'm going to do is we're going to solve for the best equilibrium subject to the fact that the central bank is time inconsistent, lacks commitment, and subject to the fact that the central bank has private information. There's a whole bunch of equilibria that we can look at. I'm going to define the set, then I'm going to look for the best one. I'm going to show you it takes a super simple structure despite the fact that it could be anything. And it's going to consist of a hawkish regime sustained by a dovish regime and vice versa, and we're going to see fluctuations between low inflation periods, high inflation periods in response to political shocks. You can think about equilibrium as strategies that depend on the entire history of inflation. So we see inflation between period 0 and 100. At period 100, the central bank has a strategy. That strategy depends on the history plus whatever political pressure it's feeling at the moment. The expectations have to be consistent with that strategy, the expectation of the private sector. And then the central bank strategy has to be optimal. And so you think about what would make it optimal. Well, a central bank has to prefer to choose the level of inflation that it chooses in equilibrium versus some other one. What are the other levels of inflation that it could choose? It could choose a level of inflation that a central bank experiencing higher political pressure would be choosing. That could count as an unobservable deviation in the sense that when the game continues, future central bankers will not know that you deviated and chose a level of inflation you weren't supposed to choose, or at least wasn't the one that it wasn't the because political pressure is unobserved, you can think that future central bankers are going to be able to deduce the political pressure that you felt simply from your inflation rates. So if you could just privately choose some other inflation rate, nobody would know that this was not the one you were supposed to be choosing. Alternatively, the central bank can go and say, well, inflation's supposed to be between 0 and 4. I'm going to go crazy and just choose 5. If you do that, then it's going to be obvious that you deviated, you chose a level of inflation that nobody is supposed to choose. How could that level of inflation be deterred? Well, by the absolute worst thing to happen off the equilibrium path. So this is basic results in game theory give you that. What would be the best deviation in this case? The best deviation would be to choose the flexible level of inflation given the political pressure and then be maximally punished off the equilibrium path. So I wanted to define the entire set of equilibria, and then I'm going to show you what the best thing that we could do in this setup would be. To do that, it's useful to just write things instead of trying to solve for the entire policy from date 0 until all of infinity. I'm just going to choose the policy today, and then we're going to choose a continuation value or social welfare for tomorrow, and then tomorrow we're going to wake up again, we're going to choose the inflation then, and the continuation value then. So that recursive structure is going to allow us to kind of solve the whole thing in closed form. So let me just represent this thing recursively. How do you do that? You can look at social welfare here. It's a function of the shocks, so there's going to be a level of inflation given the degree of political pressure. We're going to have some inflation losses from that. And then there's going to be some social welfare in the future given that level of political pressure. That's how you can represent social welfare recursively. We have to worry about feasibility. The level of inflation has to be within some feasible bounds. We need this for, these are regularity conditions. More importantly, whatever is chosen in the future in terms of welfare has to actually be sustained by future strategies. So the continuation value for society has to be below the max, V upper bar, and above the min, V lower bar. These are important objects here. This is the highest level of social welfare that is achievable. This is the lowest level of social welfare that is achievable. These objects will return in the future because I'm going to show you that this is going to be associated with a hawkish low inflation regime, and it's going to be associated with a dovish high inflation regime. In addition, you have to worry about two additional constraints. One is a private information constraint, which basically says that a central bank experiencing political pressure theta prefers to receive this flow payoff associated with its level of inflation theta and associated with this continuation value V of theta to doing something else in an unobserved fashion where it chooses level of inflation pi of theta prime. This is for some other level of political pressure and a continuation equilibrium associated with that. Okay, so that's one type of deviation. The other thing the central bank can do, it can say, screw this, I don't want to be playing this game anymore. I just want to choose my optimal flexible level of inflation, which is going to maximize my immediate welfare, and I'm going to get maximally punished. Okay, so you can represent all equilibria recursively in this way. Okay, and then I'm going to look for the best one, and I'm going to show you that it takes a really simple structure. So the best equilibrium says, let's maximize social welfare subject to private information constraint, self-enforcement constraint, feasibility constraint. That's the best equilibrium. I'm representing it recursively, so it's going to tell me what we do today at date 0, and it's going to tell me where welfare will evolve tomorrow, but it's not going to tell me anything from tomorrow onward. Okay, so what's going to happen from tomorrow onward? I'm going to show you that it's going to take a really simple structure. And one thing to keep in mind as I do that is that you can also consider the worst equilibrium, another object that I'm going to solve for, which is how to minimize social welfare, again subject to those exact same constraints. Why am I going to solve for these two things? Because what I'm going to establish is that the solution to the best equilibrium for society consists of either transitioning to remaining in the best or going to the worst, and vice versa. And this is going to be associated with a hawkish, low inflation regime, and this is going to be a dovish, high inflation regime. And we're in a transition between the two, and I'm going to establish conditions under which we do that. All right. There's a couple benchmarks I'd like to point out, and these benchmarks are useful for understanding all the different forces at play in this framework. Suppose that we didn't have to worry about enforcement. We have a very strong court system in the setup, and we can tell the central bank exactly what to do. Well, in this setup, there's no value to flexibility. There's no reason to let the central bank cave into political pressure. So then the best thing to do would be to force the central bank to choose zero inflation and to just repeat that in every single date, and then we'd be done. Okay? So clearly, the self-enforcement constraint here, if it bites, we're not going to be able to do this. What about private information? So I modeled it, we added private information. We said we can't really be certain of how much pressure is being exerted on the central bank. Well, if there was no issue of private information, it's a relatively trivial problem to solve, and it provides you with a particular prediction. Then what would happen is that the central bank would choose the lowest sort of politically feasible inflation rate, and then we would continue to repeat that in every period. So if the level of political pressure is high, you choose a higher inflation rate. If it's low, you choose a lower inflation rate. And you don't exactly choose what you'd like to do, because you know that if you kind of deviate, then you'll transition to a bad equilibrium. But that transition will never happen, and you get this kind of political shock contingent contract. Again, it doesn't look particularly realistic because we don't think of knowing exactly the degree of political pressure that's exerted on central banks. So what we do in our paper is we consider the interaction of these two constraints, lack of enforcement, private information about political pressure, and we apply methods and mechanisms, dynamic mechanism designed to basically, and we follow a first order approach, and we solve this whole thing. It could look like in principle it could be a really complicated problem. But what I'm going to show you is that it takes a really simple solution. Okay, let me define a contract real quick, and you want to keep this contract in mind because this is going to turn out to be the optimal contract. It's a very simple contract. So, I can't leave the mic. Okay, so here you have a level of political pressure on the x-axis, okay, and you have a level of inflation on the y-axis, and you have a continuation in welfare on the y-axis here. So the optimal contract at date 0 is going to look like this. It's going to be a maximally enforced inflation cap. Here, the maximally enforced inflation cap happens to coincide with the flexible inflation rate of a central bank of experiencing shock theta star. Clearly, the higher the shock theta, the higher the inflation that the central bank wants to choose. What we have here is a situation where some central banks experiencing very low levels of political pressure feel unconstrained. They choose the level of inflation they'd like to choose. They're getting maximally rewarded for it. They're getting V upper bar in the future. So we're going to remain in this nice low inflation hawkish regime if this is the level of political pressure. There are additionally some central banks that are going to feel constrained in the sense that they're going to be hitting the inflation cap. They're not going to break it. Why? Because they don't want to set a bad precedent for the future and transition to a high inflation regime in the future. This is the constrained region right here. And then if political pressure gets sufficiently high, what we're going to end up with are central banks saying, this is too low of a level of inflation for us. We're going to just break this cap, and we're going to do what we want, understanding fully that that means that we're going to transition to a bad equilibrium in the future. This theta double star here may be within the set of realized shocks or outside. What that means is that this may or may not happen along the equilibrium path, and I'm going to describe conditions under which that's the case. So this is a maximally enforced inflation cap. You tell the central bank inflation can't exceed 4. As long as it's below 4, we're just going to stay in this nice, good equilibrium. If it does exceed 4, we're going to go to something bad. I'm going to describe what that bad thing is in a little bit, but turns out that this is the best equilibrium starting from at the beginning of time, maximally enforced inflation cap. I'm not going to spend time proving this, but it's a complicated proof that builds on work that I have with Marina in other contexts with fiscal policy and debt and a lot more moving parts. But the basic idea is that we want to use very steep incentives. Why do we want to use very steep incentives? Because we want to minimize the amount of inflation that we have, and the best way to do that is to just say, well, if you exceed this level of inflation, we're going to go to the worst thing. Whether we'll go to the worst thing along the equilibrium path, whether we're going to end up in a 1970s situation, that's going to depend on a bunch of factors that I'll go through. Let me define, so now we know what happens at date 0. We have a cap. If we remain within the cap, we just restart, because this is an ID shock. What if we break the cap? What happens then? Well, we know that we're going to have to transition to a really bad situation. What's that bad situation look like? Let me describe this particular contract, which is kind of the flip of the other contract that I showed you. I'm going to describe it and I'm going to interpret it in a little bit, okay? Because it might look a little bit strange, but then when I interpret it, you'll see what I mean. It's a maximally enforced inflation floor. Here, a central bank is told, you have to have inflation above pi star here. And if you don't, and if you remain in a low inflation zone, we're going to stay in this bad equilibrium. If inflation is beyond this floor, we'll go back to the good equilibrium. Okay, so that's what this says. And clearly, if political pressure is very high, if inflation is very high, that means we can exit this zone. If inflation is low, we'll remain in this zone. The worst equilibrium is this. It's a maximally enforced inflation floor. What's the intuition for this? Well, this is the worst thing for society. The worst thing for society is a lot of inflation. And so it's not surprising that we would want to have, that a way to induce inflation is to have an inflation floor. What perhaps is surprising is that the full breakdown of the contract is not the worst equilibrium, in the sense that we do return to the good equilibrium. Okay, that's a surprising feature. Because you could have thought that what happens is we just go back into the Barrow-Gordon Wild West, where the central bank just does what it's best, it's static Nash equilibrium in every period, and that's not the worst thing. The worst thing is for the central bank to have a temporary high level of inflation, resume the hawkish regime in the future, and that turns out to lead to a very low social welfare. So what does this all mean? This means the following in terms of what we should see as the best monetary policy that a central bank can pursue under political pressure. It should start by imposing on itself an inflation cap, okay? If it satisfies and respects the cap, then then inflation expectations remain low. We stay in this low inflation hawkish regime, and everything is great. However, if political pressure is very high, the central bank is going to be so constrained, it's going to break this cap, okay? And after it breaks this cap, not only will inflation be very high immediately, it's going to be expected to be high in the future. Why? Because this temporary political pressure shock is going to have long-term consequences. Okay, it's going to have long-term consequences because there's a recognition that monetary policy discipline has broken down. What does monetary policy discipline breaking down look like? It basically means we're going to abandon the cap altogether. We're just not going to have any cap, no inflation targeting, nothing. The central bank is going to take into account, however, that once the situation gets bad enough and inflation goes sufficiently high, there will be a resumption of monetary discipline. So the idea is, what is sustaining low inflation? The fact that a central banker knows that by succumbing to political pressure, we will enter a terrible era that looks like the 70s with high inflation. That's what's sustaining low inflation. That being said, it is possible, in particular, if theta double star, which is the cutoff for political pressure, if that's within the realized set of shocks, that sometimes the central bank will succumb to the political pressure. It will succumb to the political pressure if it's sufficiently severe. And once it does so, all monetary responsibility will be lost. Central bank doesn't want to do that, but it will do that if the pressure is high enough. And then eventually, once we're in that regime, it's not necessary, once we are in this dovish regime, central bank kind of does what it wants because it's not working within a framework. However, it recognizes that once the situation gets bad enough and inflation gets sufficiently high, that there's going to be a resumption of monetary discipline. And that's why it may choose high inflation to get back to that, because the central bank wants monetary discipline in the future, it just doesn't want it in the present. So that gives a sense of the transitions. Last thing that I'll mention is, you may ask, in what circumstances are we expected to see these transitions in equilibrium? Because sometimes we could just have this dovish regime off equilibrium, so we may never come back to a high inflation era. So can we say anything about conditions under which that's going to be true? And we have a precise condition for that. To do that, we basically can define the inflation cap that is the tightest inflation cap that would be enforceable without having to go to a bad equilibrium on path. That's what this is. And using this definition, we have a condition, it's a necessary and sufficient condition for breach of the cap on path in the best equilibrium, if and only if this condition holds. And let me just talk a little bit about trade-offs, and I'll interpret this condition. You could think to yourself that we want an inflation cap that is going to be satisfied whatever the political pressure shock, okay? Now, the good thing about that is that, about such a cap, is that we will never have to transition to a bad equilibrium if we do that. But the problem with that is that it might be too lax, and we may have too high inflation. So there's a trade-off between having a tight inflation cap and low inflation today, but if that's the case, we may actually breach the cap and end up in a bad equilibrium in the future. And so we have to sort of weigh those two things against each other. What this condition tells you is that if the likelihood of having a really extreme and high political shock is low, okay, so the chance of having a crazy populist is low, well, then we might as well have a really low inflation cap, recognizing that once the crazy populist comes into office, which will happen with low probability, we're going to have to breach the cap and go into a high inflation regime. On the other hand, if political shocks are such that this is a pretty frequent occurrence, we may not actually go into a high, we may not have any of these regime transitions, we'll just have high inflation overall. So in conclusion, what we do in this paper is we consider optimal monetary policy in the presence of time-varying, privately observed political pressure. What that leads us to is a prediction that you're going to have two regimes, a hawkish regime and a dovish regime for central banks. What is going to enforce central bank behavior is the knowledge that breaking the inflation cap is going to lead to a bad equilibrium. That bad equilibrium is going to take the form of abandoning the monetary framework. But that doesn't last forever, because everybody knows that the framework will be reinstated once things get bad enough. We just have to wait until they get bad enough. That's what the model, it's a pretty parsimonious model, and that's what it says. And going back to my initial motivation, this kind of tells you that having inflation that responds to political pressure, not just in the instant, but also more dynamically. So temporary political pressure can lead to higher future inflation, even when political pressure comes back down. Having more volatile inflation, those are features of sort of optimal monetary policy in the presence of political pressure that you can't directly control. Obviously, there are other things we could do down, in the longer run to mitigate it, but if we can't control it and it's there, this is the best thing that a central bank can do. And also, in addition, I just want to mention that this is also an interpretation of particular high inflation periods as being periods where the central bank initially succumbed to the political pressure, and then that led to a more persistent increase in inflation expectations and increases in inflation as in response to that. And that's a feature. It's a feature of an optimal central bank contract, because knowing that that might happen is what restrained the central bank in the first place. Thanks very much.